Folks, I'm Doug Page, and today I'm delighted to be joined by someone I interviewed earlier this year, Mark Clifford. He's a man who needs no introduction. He is a veteran reporter with more than 30 years in Asia. His assignments included working for the Far Eastern Economic Review and Business Week magazine, and he was the editor at different times of Hong Kong's two daily newspapers, the South China Morning Post and the Standard. Today, he is the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, which is an NGO that seeks democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, at least the way it used to be in Hong Kong. Today, he is also a successful author, and he's here to discuss his new book about Hong Kong, a Hong Kong success story, in fact, a really rags to riches story. Jimmy Lai, who is currently jailed by the territory's authorities. And this is what the book looks like today. It's his new book. The title, of course, of Mark's new book, appropriately, is The Troublemaker: How Jimmy Lai Became Billionaire, Hong Kong's Greatest Dissident, and China's Most Feared Critic. Mark has also graciously allowed us to ask him some questions and give us some insight on Asia and what's going on over there, as given the fact that we have a new presidential administration and Donald Trump soon coming into power, and we'll see how they counter that part of the world. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Doug, it's great to be back. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. Jimmy Lai is one of the great entrepreneurs in Hong Kong, possibly the world. You worked with him. Tell us briefly about how he came to Hong Kong from China and the success he had there before being jailed.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for your interest. As you say, he's one of the great entrepreneurs of our time, and that was one of the biggest surprises to me in writing this book. I've known Jimmy since 1993, profiled him, was on the board of directors of his media company, but I hadn't appreciated the way in which he was forged in fires that you and I can only begin to imagine. His family was ripped apart by the Maoist communist takeover in China. He was 2 years old when that happened. His father left to Hong Kong, leaving his mother and Jimmy and his twin sister and a slightly older disabled sister pretty much to fend for themselves. Then the authorities ripped away his mother, sent her to a labor camp. You had these three young kids. Jimmy's out there hustling. He's doing black market stuff, buying and selling scrap metal, tobacco that he's finding on the streets and re-rolling. And he's 6 or 8 years old, right? I mean, it's unbelievable. At the age of 12, he gets permission from his mother and he manages to wangle a one-way permit to go to Macau, the Portuguese colony on the west side of the Pearl River Delta, near where he lived. And he went there at the age of 12, and his mother let him go because the country was in the midst of a famine that killed as many as 45 million people. I mean, you think about this, 45 million people because Mao Zedong was too boneheaded or I don't know what to do anything about it. He just let his people die by the millions, tens of
And
millions.
just to briefly interrupt, what year are we talking here?
Sorry,
1950?
we're talking late 1950s, early 1960s at this
Okay.
point. It was 1961. He was 12 and a half years old when he went to Macau. And this was, it was in the midst of what's kind of cruelly called the Great Leap Forward, where Mao thought that they could melt down a lot of, cooking pans and make backyard steel mills, and pretty soon they'd be overtaking Great Britain as an industrial power. Again, boneheaded policies that, destroyed many, many lives. And Jimmy was, again, he's forged in these fires of this kind of crucible of this famine, this political upheaval. He makes his way to Macau, he becomes a stowaway, gets on a smuggler's boat to into Hong Kong, and becomes an illegal immigrant in Hong Kong at a time when millions of refugees were fleeing the horrors of Maoist China to get into Hong Kong. People are living in shanty towns. He finds an aunt and uncle, and their place is so tiny, their little shack, that there's not even room for him to sleep on the floor that first night. So his aunt takes him over to an industrial district, knows somebody at a factory. He sleeps in the factory. Did that for quite a while. In 15 years, he goes from being a factory hand, a child laborer in a factory, to owning a factory. Pretty soon, that factory's producing more sweaters than any factory in China, maybe in Hong Kong, maybe in Asia. He's selling to the limited J.C. Penney, really top brands all around the world, especially the U.S. Spent a lot of time in New York in the garment trade. Gets bored with making sweaters, decides he's going to set up a retail chain. Pretty soon, he set up Asia's first region-wide clothing store. And the guy who, a Japanese guy named Tadashi Yanai, came down and basically learned from Jimmy and then went back and founded Uniqlo, which, well, he'd already kind of started it. But that, of course, Tadashi Yanai and Uniqlo, Tadashi Yanai is worth about $35 billion today. He is considered the kind of leading exponent of fast fashion, whatever you think of that. Jimmy basically invented it. He was ready to go into fast food. And then the Tiananmen killings of 1989 came when the government slaughtered pro-democracy, hundreds, maybe thousands of pro-democracy protesters in Beijing. So Jimmy went into media, and that's when I met him. He formed in the space of 30 years. He had well, less than 30 years, but by the time it was all over 30 years later, he had one of the most powerful and prominent Chinese language, independent Chinese language media operations in the world. At its peak, we employed about 4,000 people, mostly in Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Sure.
So quite a like kind of Horatio Alger on steroids, if you think.
Right, right, quite the story. And not to be facetious or in any way dismissive of Jimmy, but there are likely a lot of Americans, other people around the globe, who wonder, despite the great story, why should anybody really care about Jimmy at all? What is it that he symbolizes? And I know you sort of alluded to this a little bit, but what is it that he symbolizes, and was it sort of what Hong Kong symbolizes too as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, his story, I mean, it's a fair question. It's a good question. It's certainly not a facetious one. I mean, he kind of embodies and symbolizes, exemplifies Hong Kong's rise from, dirt poor, mud poor, shantytown poverty to this prosperous and free first world city, and one of the freest, most open, and most economically advanced cities in the world. 5 years, 10 years ago, Hong Kong was ranked up with London and New York as one of the great financial centers of the world. It certainly was the leading international financial center for Asia. And, Jimmy took advantage of the freedoms in Hong Kong. I mean, first the freedom to just to work, to, be able to order, afford a bowl of rice the next day. Excuse me. Then he exemplified the freedom to, own his own business and become wealthy and prosperous, and then the freedom to express himself through the media, through the magazines and newspapers he owned, and he wanted to hold China to its promises. Now, Britain colonized Hong Kong in 1841, and for 156 years, it was a British colony. For worse, for better, mostly for better. Sure, it was a colony, and there are all the issues that come with being a colony, but it was also a place that had rule of law and civil freedom. It didn't have a democracy. The last few years it was getting there, but it was a free place. And, again, Jimmy embodied that freedom. China, when it took over in 1997 from Britain, had promised that all the freedoms and the capitalist free way of life would continue in Hong Kong for the following 50 years. And Jimmy wanted to hold China to accountable, wanted to hold them to those promises. China signed an agreement, it's 40 years ago this month, with the United Kingdom, the colonial master, that kind of codified the handover. And that was in 1984. And again, China made all these solemn promises. It's an international treaty. It's lodged at the United Nations. China's turned its back on that. It's torn up that treaty, says it's not valid anymore. China promulgated a kind of mini constitution, a basic law for Hong Kong. It's not obeying that at all. And so Jimmy decided that he would give up his life as a wealthy man, his life as a free man, his life of travel, his houses in Kyoto, Taipei, apartments in Paris and London. He'd give all that up to stay in Hong Kong, even though it almost certainly meant arrest. And it has. He's been in prison for 4 years, mostly in solitary confinement. It's more than 1,400 days in prison. And getting back to your question, he exemplifies, he embodies the promise of Hong Kong, the promise of freedom, and the promises that China made and has now broken.
Gotcha. You describe in great detail how Jimmy could sort of look at a piece of clothing, come up with a new idea or a different idea or something that would might match it and be competitive. I mean, in all your time of getting to know working with Jimmy, did you sense you were working with an artist?
No, I mean, actually, I learned a lot writing this biography. As I said, I've known him since 1993. I've, been with him hundreds of times. I never intended to write a biography of him. I've written a couple of profiles, a couple of pieces about him. But in writing a biography, of course, went deeper, and so much I learned about him. An extraordinary eye for color, but paired with an entrepreneurial vision. Sometimes he saw too far over the horizon, but he could take things. It was whether it was a piece of cloth and figuring out, how to make it better, or to, make it with different fabric that would allow it to legally skirt U.S. and other textile quotas, so he could sell more cheaply. I mean, he was always looking ahead. He had that. I've met many entrepreneurs in my life, and he's really one of the top ones. And then he took that same sort of idea, he brought it to, first from making the clothes, then to selling the clothes, and then to getting into the media business, a completely new business that he knew nothing about.
Right. Yeah. Just fascinating. One of the things you point out, and you're quoting an activist here in your book, is that most freedom fighters sort of tend to be lawyers, and here's Jimmy, a businessman, instead, which sort of seems to go against the grain or what has been done previously. What what makes him tick? There's something about him that's different that you allude to. I mean, when you think about Jimmy, what is it that makes him stand out compared to others?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's got a bedrock of principle. He's got a, as he would say, the troublemaker. It's slightly tongue-in-cheek title. It's his description of himself from one of our last interviews before he went to prison. Um, Calls himself a troublemaker, but he'd probably also describe himself as stubborn. I think I might say he's principled, and so he has got three elements I think are important in understanding him, and which drive the Chinese Communist Party insane, ballistic. He's public enemy number one for them. First of all, he's rich, so he can hire great lawyers, and he's and other he traveled around. He met the vice president of the United States, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor. His wealth gave him. And his personality. I mean, it wasn't only wealth, but I mean, he could afford to travel. He could, go to DC or wherever he wanted, and he did. And he built a powerful network. And kind of complementary to that, of course, he had a platform. He had a megaphone in the form of these very popular newspapers and magazines, very, very pro-democracy, and unabashedly pro-democracy in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. So he had wealth, he had a media platform, and he had principles. And he converted to Catholicism in 1997, just a week after the Chinese communists took over Hong Kong. His wife Teresa, who's also Catholic, said, he knew trouble was coming and figured he would need help from a higher power. And she doesn't mean that facetiously. And
No, no, not at all.
whether you're a believer or not, this belief has and the love that and concern and care and time that Teresa shows him. She's in court every day. He's
Right.
undergoing an unbelievable trial right now. He's in prison. She visits him. So the fact that he has principles, he's got money, and he had a media empire, any one of these would unsettle the Chinese masters in Beijing. The combination of all three of them, especially the wealth and the fact that a businessman was willing to stand up to the communists, is something that in 75 years of communist Chinese rule, we've never seen. I've known businessmen who've tried to stand up to the Chinese or quietly give money. Um, there's one, Herbert Chow, a very brave guy who ran a small retail store in Hong Kong, Chicky Duck, selling children's clothing. And he stood up a little bit. That he just was faced terror from Chinese and Hong Kong authorities. He fled to London and shut down his store. When this happened to Jimmy, and started happening in the early '90s, where he wrote something in Next magazine that the government didn't like, so they started harassing and shut down his Giordano clothing store in Beijing. Uh, Almost every other businessman would fold their media operations or pull back. And
Or
Jim,
potentially flee too as well.
yeah, yeah, but you certainly not going to keep standing up. Jimmy, this was July '94 when he wrote this article. They shut the door in August 94. Jimmy, I haven't talked to him a lot about it at the time. He doubled down. He wrote another column. These were columns in Next Magazine. He said, "I'm sorry, I was very rude to the premier." And he really was. It was a very rude piece. He goes, "I'm sorry to be rude, but I believe what I say, and I believe it more. The Chinese Communist Party is evil. It's going to be consigned to the dustbin of history. The sooner we're done with it, the better." So how many businessmen would do that? So this was before he converted to Catholicism. So he has a core of doing what he thinks is right, no matter what the personal cost. And I think this comes out of these fires he was forged in. I mean, what he went through when he was a kid, I think he believes, I can survive it. You knock me down, I'll get back up. You take away my money, I'll make some more money. You take away my freedom, okay, I can be free in my head. And so that's what he's doing now in prison, in solitary confinement. A 77-year-old man, no natural daylight, diabetes, had COVID in prison, had a cataract operation that didn't go too well in prison. But he says, I'm going to live freely in my own mind. You decide when I'll be physically free. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, decides when my captors will release me, but I'm going to be free in my mind. And that's what he's done. And the earlier question you had about him being an artist, he's spending his time essentially living the life of a Benedictine monk. It's very structured. It's not the life of a wild-eyed prophet out in the desert. It's the life of a guy who doesn't decide when the lights come on. He doesn't even have a clock. He eats when his captors tell him to. He eats what he obviously has no choice about what he's going to eat or when he's going to eat, but he spends as much of his time drawing. He's actually a remarkable artist, not just in making clothes, but in drawing. And that's another thing that came out in the book. I knew he had a great eye for color. I didn't know he spent months in Amsterdam at the studio of Wallace Ting, a Chinese American, one of the top Chinese American artists of the 20th century. So he's drawing a lot. He's reading scripture, theology, praying, and he's doing prison labor. He makes 600 envelopes a week at a penny an envelope.
He holds a British passport, if I'm correct, which obviously makes him a British national. What has been the involvement of the UK government with regards to Jimmy Lai these days?
Well, it's increasing, and that's welcome. You're right. He holds a British passport. That's the only passport he holds. He's never held a Chinese passport. He has a Hong Kong ID card, identification card, which is kind of like a driver's license. Everybody has to have one. Um, but the UK government has not been quite as assertive as I think many of us would like them to be. Um, Kira, things are getting better, but they're still denied consular access. The Chinese claim that he's a Chinese national. There don't seem to be any legal grounds for this, but that doesn't usually stop the Chinese Communist Party from doing whatever it wants. So they haven't given consular access to the UK consul general or Hong Kong staff as they're obligated to under international treaties. There's been some movement. We had a hard time even getting the British government to say Jimmy's name publicly. We've had fantastic support. Or I say we, I mean the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, which is advocating not only for Jimmy's release, but for the release of the 1,900 or so political prisoners in Hong Kong. An incredible number when you think that it was nothing 5 years ago. They're now mentioning his name more. I mean, again, we've had great parliamentary support. I noticed that the last prime minister, Rishi Sunak, has now been grilling the current prime minister, Keir Starmer, about what he's going to do about Jimmy Lai. He didn't seem quite as interested in the case when he was in 10 Downing Street. But hey, we'll take progress where we can. And in all seriousness, there is real progress. Keir Starmer, the prime minister, brought the issue of Jimmy Lai and his captivity, his unjust detention, up with Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping at the G20 meeting or on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Peru a month or so ago in front of TV cameras. So, look, we're starting to see a little more momentum on the part of the British government. They have a policy of not negotiating for hostages, which is essentially what Jimmy is. They also have a lot of concern about the British economy, especially post-Brexit. They need friends wherever they can get them, and they think China is a pretty important economic partner, one that's too big to risk angering, and it's not clear that they think Jimmy Lai is important enough to, really go to the mat for. And as I say, we're starting to see some progress, cautious optimism that we could see some kind of deal in the coming year. And that obviously we've got a new administration in the UK, are relatively young, with Keir Starmer and Labour being back in power, and we've got a new administration coming into office, and I guess it's a new administration anyway, a different administration coming into office in the US. I mean, this unusual situation of the penultimate president becoming the next president.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. Um, You say that when he started the Apple Daily newspaper in Hong Kong, that it did something special for the people of Hong Kong. Tell us what it did.
Well, I mean, it broke up the old cozy relationships between journalists and business people and politicians. So, Jimmy started first with Next magazine, which came out in 1990, March 1990. So 9 months after the Tiananmen killings in Beijing, that galvanized Jimmy to get into media. And Next immediately hired a team of investigative reporters and put them to work. Again, exposing a lot of the kind of secrets of Hong Kong's power elite, and so that investigative kind of strand of the DNA, which was powerful throughout the 30 something years that Next and Apple Daily were part of the Hong Kong media scene, was completely innovative, but also this very feisty pro-democracy slant was very important, because at a time when people were nervously looking over their shoulder to see the guys from Beijing as they got closer and closer, as the 1997 handover from British colonial rule to Chinese, dare I say, colonial communist rule, approached, most publishers were backing off from democracy. And Jimmy realized he had a market. Most Hong Kong people were pro-democracy. The first territory-wide elections had been held in 1991, right around the time right after he started Next. And 6 out of 10 people voted for the pro-democracy candidate. So when I first met Jimmy in 1993, I mean, honestly, I thought it was a little crazy to be starting a newspaper. I mean, it's hard enough in any environment, but Hong Kong was a saturated media environment, and the communists were coming. And it's expensive to start a newspaper from nothing. But
And were these in English and Cantonese, or
no, no, they were only in Chinese. But as you say, interesting point. In Cantonese, they for the first time used almost made up written Cantonese, a very vernacular, very slangy, very verbal language, and they used characters, and made it actually so mainlanders couldn't actually read Apple. They could read most of the other Hong Kong newspapers, but yes, they were Chinese. Towards the end, he had some English language websites, but overwhelmingly Chinese. And yeah, so he brought this pro-democracy, pro-investigative, no holds barred. But he also brought starlets and paparazzi and, some pretty tawdry stuff. And he did it all with state-of-the-art Goss printing presses, some of the best, probably the best printing presses in the world, fantastic paper, ink. I mean, we don't think about these things, but when I look at, Apple Daily and, the luxury ads they'd have from companies like LVMH, that Jimmy always, whether it was he was making sweaters or shirts or newspapers, always had a commitment to the highest quality. And that's true to his staff, and he paid his staff well above the market rates.
gotcha? You know, in 1989, Tiananmen Square has a certain impact in the United States. It was pretty easy to ignore. You didn't really have to pay attention to it because obviously it's not in the U.S. backyard. But if you're in Hong Kong and you're miles away from the Chinese border, it's going to have a very different impact on you. What does that impact have on Jimmy? What kind of impact do you think that has on the average person in Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, I mean, fear for the average person. For Jimmy, I mean, I think heartbreak. He'd fled China as a, young teen, not even a teenager, right? A 12 and a half year old guy. And he'd made his fortune in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was all about freedom. And he'd seen the economic reforms in China started in the 1980s under Paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, and Jimmy had been so enamored. He thought, wow, at last China is going to realize its potential. It's going to leave the madness of the Mao period behind. We're going to make China great again. And he's such a Chinese patriot, which is why it's such an irony to see him on trial right now for, trying to undermine the Chinese state. Yes, he hates the Chinese Communist Party, but he loves China. And so he saw these economic reforms of the 80s, and then he saw the students out there in the spring of 1989, bravely marching or sitting in, demonstrating for democracy. And then he watched the tanks roll in and kill, as I said, hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And he said, I've got to do something. And we have to remember, we're in such a different technology age. CNN had just started in the early 1980s, and Jimmy, is Tiananmen. The Tiananmen killings were one of the first times we saw, as Americans, saw an international event from halfway around the world, pretty much in real time. We didn't have to wait for the film to, come out and watch, some scenes a couple days later. And Jimmy just realized there were technological possibilities. And it was interesting. It was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was later that year. But he realized, technology allowed media companies to do something, to shine a spotlight on bad events, and hopefully to change those. And like many people, he'd seen Taiwan, South Korea, other places develop politically, become more liberal politically and socially as they developed economically. And he thought that was going to happen in China. He was devastated by the killings at Tiananmen. He had supported the students. He'd sold T-shirts to raise money for the students in Beijing, sent them tents. He was watching from Hong Kong. So was the entire colony. It was a little less than 7 million people at that point, maybe closer to 6. And yet you had 500,000 people marching in a typhoon in support of the Tiananmen protesters, because most of these people or their parents had come from China. They
Right.
knew how evil the Chinese communists could be,
Right.
and they knew they were coming again in 1997. They had been so hopeful in the 1980s, and then in the spring of democracy, and now this.
Right. You know, if I'm understanding here correctly, Jimmy is the first high-profile individual in Hong Kong to really be arrested for violating, China's national security law. Uh, can you describe the law? And then curious, was he just jailed to make an example?
Yeah, I mean, can I describe the law? It has technical provisions like subversion, collusion with foreigners. Um, it's also vague that it's kind of whatever the government wants it to be. I follow his trial, which has been going on for over a year now. It started in mid-December 2023. And it's been 4 years since he was jailed. And I'm really struggling. There are two counts of collusion. So I'll talk about it more in connection with Jimmy. Um, but the two counts of collusion with foreigners, and it basically seems that he's guilty of practicing journalism. There was some meetings he had. I alluded to them before with Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton. All of them at the time, those were their titles. They're obviously long gone from those positions. He met them a year before the national security law came into effect, and yet the prosecution has spent an inordinate amount of time in a trial that's gone on over 110 days so far and has no signs of reaching a conclusion. Spent an inordinate amount of time talking about his meetings with these three administration officials, and did he ask them for the U.S. to impose sanctions on Hong Kong human rights violators or not? Jimmy did not. It's pretty clear that he didn't. The Wall Street Journal's Bill McGurn has written extensively on this. He's gone back and contacted all of them. At least some of those officials have gone and looked at, maybe all of them, gone and looked at the readouts of those meetings. No, nothing in there about sanctions. But I mean, let's unpack this. Even if he did, I could go to China and ask for sanctions on, some U.S. official. Am I going to be slapped in jail? We had Jane Fonda. A lot of people didn't like it, but she went to Hanoi during the Vietnam War. the whole thing is preposterous. So the meetings happened a year before this law came into effect. He may or may not, but it seems that he didn't, and all the evidence points to the fact that he didn't ask for sanctions. But then he and I were on a number of actually calls like this, live stream Zoom calls, and with a number of guests, some American official, former American officials. Did he mention sanctions there? I mean, I frankly don't remember, but this has been a huge focus of the trial. And again, you just kind of unpack this. Okay, somebody asked for sanctions. Actually, in fact, my group, the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, is working to put sanctions on more Hong Kong officials. I guess that means I shouldn't go back to Hong Kong because I would be, immediately pronounced, well, maybe not immediately pronounced guilty because these trials take forever, but I would seemingly be running afoul of the national security law. We've had people, wearing t-shirts. There's some related national security legislation, but the net effect of it is in Hong Kong, which 5 years ago was a city more or less as free as New York or San Francisco or London or Paris, is a place where if you wear a t-shirt that authorities don't like, they throw you in jail, which they've done. If you don't look respectful enough when the Chinese national anthem is being played, or you face the other direction, they throw you in jail. I mean, these are thought crimes. So this is a law in search of, I would say, victims. Did they put Jimmy in jail to make an example? Absolutely. But he's more than just a random person. He is really public enemy number one as far as the Chinese government is concerned. They've consistently, at the highest levels, except not Xi Jinping, but very authoritatively pronounced him guilty. They somehow see him as this black hand, this mastermind of Hong Kong protests. There were 2 million people repeatedly out in the streets of Hong Kong. This is a city of 7.5 million people. 2 million people coming out repeatedly. Other marches, 1 million or more during the summer of 2019. Was Jimmy Lai responsible for getting all those people out? I don't think so. Every single election from that first one in 1991 until the last free election in 2019, we've had 6 out of 10 people voting for the pro-democracy camp in Hong Kong. Hong Kong people want freedom. They want democracy. They got a taste of it during 156 years of British colonial rule, and they just want the right to elect their mayor and their city council. China can't tolerate that. Can't tolerate this mild expression of autonomy, despite having promised this from this far off city that's over 1,000 miles from the capital.
Sure. Are the people in Hong Kong living in fear of being randomly picked up by the police, is it perhaps, or maybe having them come pounding on the doors at night?
Some of them certainly are, but there's been a lot of pounding on the doors over the last few years. So there's definitely a feeling of fear. There's a feeling of, you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know if you've crossed a line. The great sinologist Perry Link, who's actually on the board, full disclosure, of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, describes it as famously described the Chinese Communist Party as like an anaconda and a chandelier. So you've got this huge snake, and underneath you've got a wonderful ballroom. People are all dressed up. They're having canapes and drinking champagne and having a great time. But they all know that there's this snake up there, and it's unpredictable. It doesn't have to do too much. Every once in a while, it might kind of reach out and grab somebody, or it might just raise its eyebrow. People make adjustments, and they try to avoid attracting the wrath of the snake. So I think most people just self-censor, and I know for a fact, I don't want to go into details, but the media is definitely doing this. I've had personal contact. I mean, people in Hong Kong, I've had conversations like this canceled because people are afraid of what it would do to their business if they have a conversation like this with me. I mean, there are a lot of examples like that, people who've been, very, very helpful friendly to me. It's not a personal thing, but couldn't get permission to use some photographs for this latest book because people didn't want to be cited in the credits as having let me use one of their photographs. there are, many. I interviewed close to 100 people for this book, and well over 100 interviews in all. Um, many people didn't even want to. Of course, they didn't want their name used in the book. They didn't want their name in the acknowledgments. And these are people who've known Jimmy 30, 40 years, but they still have some tie to Hong Kong. So yeah, there's a lot of fear. I think it's also interesting, and as I said, I can't go back there, but from what I hear from people who are there, particularly the elite, are living in a bubble. They've convinced themselves that they're victims, that Americans and other maybe people like me who are trying to hold a spotlight on abuses in Hong Kong, that we're being unfair, that the government had to crack down on a society that had gotten out of control in 2019. I think that's absolute nonsense, and I just shows unfortunately a real parochialism on the part of the Hong Kong elite. A long-standing parochialism, I would say.
The last time we spoke, you compared how Hong Kong's Hang Seng index performed compared to the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and vice versa. And I just, the other day when I was preparing for this interview with you, I sort of took a look at some numbers, and the Hang Seng in 1992 was about 4,300. Today, it's nearly right around 20,000, having grown about 4.5 times over the last 32 years. And in comparison, if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average during the same period, you get nearly 14 times the growth in comparison. What brings about this disparity? Is it the rulers in Hong Kong? Is it the fear of China? What brings this about?
Yeah, a good question. I think I would say, though, it's going to be a little pedantic, but it might be more interesting to compare not 1992, but mid 1997, because between 92 and 97, excuse me, the Hang Seng, I think, roughly tripled, almost quadrupled. So it was closer, it was 15,000 something at the time of the Chinese handover. And as you say, it's close to 20 now. It's kind of been in a narrow range, and it was up around 30. So you've had a period of more than 25 years, 27 years, and they, check my numbers, Doug, but I mean, I think the Hang Seng has gone up less than 30%. And as you say, with Dow Jones or the S&P has gone up 14-fold. I don't know what it is since 97, but many, many, many times as quickly. And yet, and to kind of compound the paradox that you're talking about, Hong Kong has been the international capital market for the fastest growing economy that the world will ever see, not has ever seen and will ever see, 10% growth for a period of 3 decades or so. So that's doubling every 7 years. And yet the stock market has kind of pretty much been flatlining. And I would say it's a combination of political, well, mostly political, but also governance issues. You don't have anymore an open and free press. And I say that any true international financial market needs free flow of information. I mean, you just need to sort things out. I mean, you have lots of rumors and gossip and short sellers and other things, but the market needs to sort things out. It needs information to sort things out. The less people trust information, the harder it is to get true price discovery. And I would argue, and I think I'm on pretty firm ground here, that Hong Kong and Chinese companies, but Hong Kong listed companies don't have the same governance standards that U.S. ones do, and that has held back the return to shareholders. So if you look at total return, you look at dividends, share price appreciation, I mean, Hong Kong just it's in the dust. I think even if you look at India versus China, I haven't seen recent numbers on that, but I think you'd find a total return in India, which might, in a way, because it's got, it's a big country, it's a developing country, it has its own governance issues, but it has more of a legacy of British legal tradition and of regulatory oversight of a free press, however imperfect India is. And I think it's done better than China. So, I think that the governance issues in Hong Kong, which are connected to the political ones, have real economic effects.
So in essence, if you're going to have a free market, you sort of need free information too as well, and that doesn't seem
Absolutely.
to be the case over
Absolutely.
there. Let's turn to China here. You talked about Xi Jinping here. Not to be facetious here, but was it a relief for Xi Jinping to see the return of Trump as opposed to having to get to know Vice President Kamala Harris? And then if you're Xi Jinping, I mean, any thoughts about how he might compare Biden to Trump, Trump to Biden?
Great questions. I am a historian and I don't predict the future, but we can look at the last Trump administration and perhaps make just a few comments and thoughts. I I don't it's really hard to say. They're so different. I mean, I think Harris was or is obviously less experienced on the international stage and with foreign affairs. She probably would have had, would have been kind of Biden, version two in terms of a lot of the people. Um, I think we've had enough time to see that since 2016 and 2017 when Trump took office, he's really shifted the entire global narrative, the optics vis-a-vis China. He's been erratic about it. Sometimes he's having a chocolate dessert, at Mar-a-Lago or Brazil or wherever with Xi Jinping and sometimes he's putting tariffs on. So he's it's kind of a shapeshifter, and I think that really throws the Chinese off because they like stability and continuity, and in that sense, I think they would have preferred Harris. On the other hand, Trump is very transactional, and I think the Chinese may feel that they can get the better of him. Like they do one small thing, but then he lets them. He kind of doesn't really go toe to toe with them if they try to squeeze Taiwan more forcefully. So, it's it's really hard to say, but I do think that his first administration and people like Matt Pottinger and John Bolton and others in the administration really did the American people and the entire world a favor by alerting people to the I would say the evil practices of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, there are the rapacious business and economic practices, the inability of China to live up to its commitments under the World Trade Organization, which again, you could say Trump is transactional, he's mercantilist, he doesn't really understand international trade, but hey, he understood it enough to, really start making the Chinese pay more of a cost. Is that ultimately going to help China because it forces them to increase domestic consumption, which they need to do, and force them to offshore and to have diversified their manufacturing base? Maybe. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, what's your take on his selection of former U.S. Senator David Perdue as the next U.S. ambassador to China? Is this a good pick?
Not sure. I don't know enough about Purdue. I know there are people who are concerned that he's going to be quite accommodating. I am very encouraged by the selection of current Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State and of Dan Waltz as, not Dan Waltz, Mike Waltz as um, security advisor. I think both these guys have a long track record vis-a-vis and a very clear-eyed assessment of China and of the importance of human rights in our foreign policy. I mean, human rights is, a great, I guess you could say a trump card. It's just a great way in which the U.S. Has something that, I mean, certainly China can't offer. Most countries can't, and I think human rights under both Democratic and Republican administrations has kind of been given, short shrift for too long. And that would be a whole nother podcast. But I am encouraged that he's got some pretty hard edged. You could call them China hawks in there. Some people who I think have a very realistic assessment of China, of its, as I said before, rapacious practices in many areas, and particularly understand the importance of human rights. I should also say it was enormously encouraged that President-elect Trump has said that he would get Jimmy Lai out. He said 100%, it'll be easy, guaranteed. And he did get, I guess it was a trio of college students who had actually done some bad stuff. They've been shoplifting I think it was in Chongqing, in a central Chinese city, and he got them out during his first term. So, he knows how to do these sorts of transactions, these deals. And a deal to let Jimmy Lai out is only going to happen at the very, very highest level. So Trump, Xi Jinping, Keir Starmer as the PM of the country where Jimmy is a citizen, the UK. that's where it's got to happen. And I'm glad to see that even before he's taken office, President-elect Trump is on the case.
Right. China is always in the news, it seems. And then today, of course, there's a story in the Wall Street Journal talking about Chinese-made routers by a company called TP-Link. The company apparently has about a 65% share of the market in the United States. There seems to be some worry that they are used to spy on the American public, maybe hack laptops, desktops, potentially their phones, tablets, who knows. Microsoft at least seems to think so. Is this just sort of normal behavior for China? Should we start looking at every good that's made out of China and sit there and say, maybe not, don't buy it?
Well, I mean, it is normal behavior for China, but we shouldn't normalize it. I think China will try to get any advantage it can. It has a very zero-sum approach to international relations. China has managed to play the victim, even as the U.S. and other free countries have facilitated its rise. As I said, the greatest economic growth, sustained economic growth we've ever seen from a country in history, let alone the most populous one. But China plays a victim card. China has said it's a victim, despite the fact that we have allowed it to grow. I mean, of course, the hard work. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from the Chinese, more than 1 billion Chinese people and workers who've made this possible. We've facilitated it, and I think we've been incredibly naive, and particularly when it comes to technology issues, whether it's TP-Link or it's Huawei or it's ZTE or it's TikTok. We've been incredibly naive. Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that data is the new oil. The Chinese don't know what they're doing with all that data, but they are scarfing up, scooping up as much data as they can on all of us. And yeah, I think we should be worried. I don't think we need to worry about every Nike sneaker that comes in, but I think technology products need to be looked at very, very carefully. And of course, it's going to be disruptive, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be inflationary, but why would we want to have our futures held hostage to China that has said it's preparing for war with us, that views us as the enemy? I mean, shouldn't we start trying to decouple now? I mean, I know there were some steps taken during the first Trump administration. The Biden administration actually, I think, very, very smart and much more strategic and focused, particularly on technology issues, than the Trump administration was. I hope that's continued in the next Trump administration. And this is a really important security issue. And if we don't deal with it now, we're either going to be under the thumb of the Chinese, having access to our most intimate thoughts and actions and able to influence our policies on a range of issues, whether it's Taiwan or Xinjiang, where they're, imprisoning Muslims, or Hong Kong, or anything else, biotechnology. I mean, the future is that China wants to control the global debate on everything, and they don't believe in freedom. So if we let them into our home, we're asking for trouble.
Do you think, with Trump's return, that North Korea's Kim Jong Un will want to sit down with him?
Yeah, I have to give Trump credit. He was the first. He tried to break the logjam with the Kims. Remember, this is the third Kim that has, grandfather, father, son that's run North Korea since, it came out of the ashes of, a divided Korea came out of the ashes of World War II in 1945. We've tried a lot. I don't know. I think Trump felt pretty burned by North Korea last time around. If the reports are to be believed that North Korea has upward of 10,000 troops fighting in Ukraine, looks to me like we're closer to the beginning of World War III than we are to some kind of détente between the U.S. and North Korea. But hard to say. And again, I think that's what's going to be very, very interesting about a Trump administration, and may throw the Chinese and many of the rest of us off balance, because this is a guy who is very tactical, likes to surprise, likes to come up with innovative moves, and I'm sure it'll be interesting for the next 4 years.
Yeah. Taiwan. There apparently is one of the largest Chinese maritime exercises going on right now in the Western Pacific, and apparently it includes Taiwan. What's at stake for the United States if Taiwan is successfully invaded and taken over by Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the best parallel would be the Cold War. I mean, we decided we did not want the Soviets to take over Germany and some other parts of Western Europe, Italy in a different sense. And I think it would have been a disaster if they did. It would have been that much harder, if not perhaps impossible. Maybe we'd still be living under a period of Soviet rule. And I think um, China's not going to stop with Taiwan. First of all, they have no rights to Taiwan. They have no claim to it. And their posture on this is just spurious. It's bloviation. I'm sorry that Nixon and Kissinger signed the agreement they did. Uh, but anyway, that's the world we're in. I don't think an invasion is either inevitable or imminent. But the Chinese are going to just keep squeezing, and I hope that President Trump and his administration can stay strong because if they're allowed to take Taiwan, then that whole what's called the first island chain is all of a sudden more vulnerable. The Philippines is obviously next, and you're not going to see a Chinese commissar in the Philippines, but you're going to see the Philippines having to bend their knee to China as they've had to do on some things. They're standing tough in terms of trying to defend their islands, which are slowly being encroached on throughout the South China Sea. Vietnam, even South Korea and Japan, I think are going to have to bend to the will of the Chinese if they take Taiwan. I mean, they already are to some extent. The Chinese have an inordinate influence in the Pacific, and of course, they're a large economy. They're going to have a big role in the neighborhood, but they've made no secret of their desire to push the U.S. out of the Western Pacific, and I think that would be a bad thing for freedom and for the world economy. I mean, you're putting billions of people under the boot of a Chinese totalitarian government. That's what's at stake. It's not just one little island of 20 million people that happens to be a key producer of semiconductors globally. I mean, we can start making semiconductors somewhere else, but you surrender the freedom of 25 million people who don't want to be under the control of these thugs, this is like the mafia that's running China. That's what the Chinese Communist Party is. They care about power, they care about control, they care about money. And I don't think it's to in anybody's interest to let them do more than they've done. And just as Putin wasn't stopped early enough, I would say Xi Jinping hasn't been stopped enough. What he's done in Xinjiang, where you have more people in civilians being held in captivity and concentration camps than you've had since the Nazi period. And the world's, it's barely registered on the world. The US has been ahead, but we could do more. You have Hong Kong. It's another reason why it's very important to stand tall for Hong Kong, to keep fighting for the freedom of Jimmy Lai, 1,900 political prisoners in Hong Kong, and the 7.5 million Hong Kong people who are living under the yoke of Chinese rule, because dictators don't stop. And Xi Jinping, who's now installed himself as dictator for life, isn't going to stop unless we stop him.
Right. When we talked back earlier this year, you mentioned, and I asked you about, did Nixon make a mistake in trying to normalize relationships with China? You seem to indicate that was probably a good idea. Now it sounds like you've changed your mind a little bit. Nothing wrong with changing your mind. I mean, we all do. But I'm sort of curious. I mean, earlier this year, I also had a guy who was a retired Navy captain. At one point, he was the chief of intelligence of the United States Pacific Fleet. He co-authored a book with another guy, and they talked about their book. And basically, what they said was the thrust of the book is that we were all fooled by Deng Xiaoping. Here we are. We seem to have one thought about what China was going to look like given all this economic freedom that came through. Now it seems like we're dealing with a monster we never imagined, certainly in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I say this as someone who's just listened to experts like you, listened to others too as well. There's been a sea change in the thinking about what China is and today. I mean, how do you talk about this? What's your sense of it?
Yeah. First of all, I don't think Nixon and I was talking narrowly about Taiwan. I mean, that was the key point in terms of normalizing relations with the PRC in the late 1970s. And by the way, it was done under Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski in the end. So I can't put it all on Nixon and Kissinger. Look, I think it was right to try to engage China. I was a big proponent of China getting into the WTO. I don't think I was wrong about that, but I have colleagues, and we think of somebody like Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Emerita on the Hill, and others who fought against giving China a permanent most favored nation status, which let it ship its goods at favorable duty and tariff rates to the U.S. Who fought that all throughout the 1990s. It was Bill Clinton who came in and talked about dictators from Baghdad to Beijing, and then delinked human rights and business in the case of China. I now think that we were definitely wrong, and I was on the wrong side of that. I mean, I wrote a book when China got into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, called Changing China, Changing World Trade. I wrote it with the incoming Director General of the World Trade Organization. We were right in many senses that it would supercharge the Chinese economy and it would lead to a number of reforms. It did. What we didn't see, and I don't think anybody, even the people who elected Xi Jinping, realized, yes, this monster that they were electing. So yes, I think we were naive to believe that a communist regime was going to go kind of social democratic and was going to go softer and was going to undergo the kind of democratic transition that South Korea and Taiwan did. But I don't think it was inevitable that I think it was worth trying. I think it was worth making the effort. I mean, I think as Nixon wrote in that famous Foreign Affairs article in, I think, 1968 when he was running for president, you can't ignore the biggest country in the world. And with over 1 billion people, you've got to somehow make them part of the world community. Certainly the US, as the global leader, needed to. I think we should have held their feet to the fire much more on everything from human rights issues to compliance with the WTO. We kind of just the Chinese are look, they're great negotiators. They're diplomats, their negotiators work for their interests, and they do a terrific job at it. And we just, we didn't hold them enough to their agreements, whether it's the Sino-British Declaration or the WTO or, the fentanyl agreements we have going now. We've kind of make these agreements and don't really enforce them. But so yes, I think it was worth making the effort. But I think we should have been clear-eyed earlier.
Sure.
Again, just one final thing. I
Yeah.
think Xi Jinping did us a great thought by coming to power and having such a brutal approach 12 years ago. If Xi Jinping were just coming to power as part of the normal rotation, Mr. Chairman Wang served for 10 years, the normal rotation, and then Xi Jinping came in now, it probably would have been too late, but at least we've had time and we have started waking up. It's not too late. It's not early. We've got time. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have time.
Right, right. And then just real quickly here on TikTok. I mean, now TikTok is sitting before the United States Supreme Court. It's a big part of American social life these days. A lot of entrepreneurs use TikTok and videos to, you know, sell things, do things. I mean, if you were sitting there advising the U.S. Supreme Court what to do with TikTok, what would you tell them?
Well, I can't obviously get into the legal grounds, but I think there's been a very clear determination by the U.S. Congress that we want TikTok out, and I think I'd hope that the Supreme Court would affirm that. As I said a few minutes ago, Xi Jinping thinks that data is the new oil, and we know that they're mining TikTok. We already know that they're tweaking the algorithm to influence debates in America. We see it in the Hong Kong activist community. They tweak things so it's much harder to find our point of view. Same thing with pro-democracy people relating to Taiwan, things relating to the Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghur Muslims, Tibetans. We're already seeing this. I mean, it's happening in real life where this thing that's like a central communications platform for hundreds of millions of Americans is being manipulated evilly by a foreign government to shut down free speech. So I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, sure. Uh, There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, or on the Wall Street Journal's op-ed pages yesterday by Amy Knight, and she suggested that Russia's Vladimir Putin, perhaps all dictators, are in a much weaker position than most of us in the United States realize. Most of this is because of the Assad regime falling in Syria, and that this is obviously going to make Putin potentially vulnerable internally, maybe not so much externally outside of Russian borders, but certainly inside Russian borders. Um, does any of this apply to Xi Jinping? I mean, is he vulnerable in any way to being deposed? And if so, how do you think it would happen?
Yeah, I mean, people have been predicting the downfall of the Chinese Communist Party at least since 1989, and of course they've been wrong. It seems like it's impossible to see these big historical movements coming until they're here. I mean, they're revolutionary. I mean, a month ago, I mean, would any of us have any idea? I'm not sure that the people in the White House had any idea that this was about to, have this tumultuous effect in Syria. And it seems beyond. I mean, looks to me like the Iranian regime, I mean, from a distance, they've suffered a huge defeat. Is it going to come home to haunt them and, potentially Putin, as you say? Possible. China, from the outside, looks pretty, Xi Jinping looks like he has a very, very strong position. The problem with dictators is the more control they have, the more control they want. And then the more fragile they sort of appear. So just look at the examples I mentioned in Hong Kong before. I mean, Doug, you spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and you know it is a free and open city. Can you imagine that they nabbed somebody wearing a t-shirt and throw him in the slammer because they didn't like what it said, or somebody was facing the other way at the national anthem, let alone the people who were booing the national anthem, they throw them in jail? I mean, boy, if you did that in America, our jails would be pretty full. If everybody who was disrespectful towards the government, depending on which administration's in power, you'd have to have half the population in jail, kind of sequentially. I mean, you can't do that. You can't do that forever. And I mean, again, Xi Jinping has this technology. He seems to have unparalleled control over his society, and yet, he's got this continuing cycle of purges. He's tossed out a number of very senior people that he has put in power. It's one thing when you come to power and you toss out, your rival for power, as he did around 2012, when another guy on the Politburo, Bo Xilai, looked like he was making a move for maybe a counter coup. Well, Bo has been spending his time behind bars for the last 12 years or so. Didn't help that his wife was implicated in the murder of a British businessman, but that was kind of a convenient pretext. But Xi Jinping, he's kicked out his foreign minister, the defense minister, a number of people from the rocket division of the PLA. I mean, there's this ongoing purge of the PLA, which, is, perhaps can give us a little comfort vis-a-vis Taiwan. I don't think he feels comfortable yet with his military lineup. So, impossible to say, but I certainly am not going to predict he's going to be dislodged from power. I mean, he could be in power a long, long time. I mean, he's a relatively uh, young guy. He's just turned 70, I believe. So, he could have another 20, 25 years of pulling the strings, either, in the general secretary title, or Deng Xiaoping at the end. I think his only official title was chairman of the Chinese Bridge Association. But, these elders stay around for a long time. And he is he's unique in his ability to wield power and do it in a consistent, strategic way. I mean, in a way that Mao couldn't. Mao was too erratic, too undisciplined.
Right, right. Well, Mark, thank you so very, very much for coming by today to talk to me about your new book and provide us with some insight on what's going on in Asia and in China. It is a fascinating topic. It is certainly not about to go away anytime soon, but it's always a pleasure to speak with you and learn more about your insight and get your take on events too as well.
Well, Doug, it's always great to talk to you. It's, nice to have a conversation among friends and to share our thinking, and just love your insights and your interest in Asia. So thank you. Look forward to doing it again.
Sure. Thank you so much.